All right, we're back. Now, the only thing I have to say in introducing Nicola is that she refuses to let me introduce her, so here she is.
Thank you, Peter. That's a slight exaggeration of what I said. But anyway, kia ora, koto. Thank you so much for being here still on this very, very cold Saturday in Auckland. So I'm going to try and do some theology now. But thank you so much for all the wonderful practical ideas that have come up so far. So the reason I said that to Peter is that I was just going to tell you that I'm involved both with New Zealand Christians in Science. I'm the director of that, and also I'm the chair of the board of a Rocha, which does Eco-Church, the Eco-Church program. So I do think that both of these are very complementary organizations because science gets us connected to the natural world, and it also provides some of the solutions that we are going to be using, apart from all of these reducing that, our impact. We're also going to need technical solutions as well, and science does bring some of those. So these are very, very complementary organizations. Okay, so to start, in the beginning, in Genesis, we read, that God created humans in God's own image. In the image of God they were created. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." You must be all very familiar with that. Genesis 2:15 has a very different kind of it says, "The Lord God took the human and put them in the Garden of Eden to serve and preserve it." Well, that's Norm Habel's translation anyway. So serve and preserve, or rule and subdue. We've been living in that tension ever since. Human beings don't need, at least modern human beings, don't need any excuse to rule and subdue. But this has given modern humans an excuse to rule and subdue. And so really, the rule and subdue should be read through the lenses of Genesis 2:15, and then also the rest of the Bible, including the incarnation, where God came in a sacrificial way to serve and preserve us and to save us. So just to sort of note that this is the tension, and that what we are trying to move towards, obviously, is how we serve and preserve the natural world. As part of our mission right back there in Genesis 2. Plastic, we're talking about plastic today, but really, of course, we're talking about everything: climate change, carbon dioxide, plastic, defilement. So the Bible doesn't, of course, say anything about plastic. There wasn't any. But it does say something about defilement. So there are a number of places in which the Bible talks about pollution and defilement, and one of them is, for example, Isaiah 24:4-6, where it says, "The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth. The earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws and violated the statutes and broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse consumes the earth. Its people must bear their guilt. Therefore the earth's inhabitants are burned up, and very few are left." There's nothing quite like the Bible for drastic statements. However, when we look into the near future, we can think, well, maybe the Bible is right about some of these things. So the Bible does talk about defilement, and both moral and physical and material pollution are very much linked in the Bible. And that's what we see in our world today as well. Pollution can be visible pollution, like the plastics that Lydia and Jennifer were talking about. Or they can be invisible, of course, like the carbon dioxide that's causing, that's causing climate change. Invisible pollution is not just plastics, but microplastics, forever chemicals, carbon dioxide, methane, and all those sorts of things. So they all pollute and defy the earth. I think this book, Climate: A New Story, is a very good one, because he also is saying, that it's not just carbon dioxide and heat that matters, but also pollution, and that we need to look at all of these things at the same time. He's not a Christian, but he does say that we need to develop a sacred view of the earth in order to get reconnected to it and in order to be healers of the earth. I have a picture over there of an albatross, one of the most famous birds that cannot tell the difference between its own food and plastic. They live in remote colonies very often, but you find that their guts are full of plastic. And it really is a sign of how far plastic does spread once you sort of dump it in the sea. Now, of course, it's always very hard to understand how plastic gets into the sea, but looking at some of Lydia's pictures about great big plastic containers full of bottles sitting beside the sea and being transported over the sea, you can think, well, it's very easy, actually, how plastic gets into the sea. So the ill effects we experience, however, are the work of humanity. God doesn't come along and just sort of like burn up the earth or destroy it. We are destroying the earth. And so it's very important to sort of see that the message here is that we do have freedom and we can act. Okay, so how do we fail to serve and preserve as Christians? I think there are 3 ways I want to look at. One is that we feel too small to do anything. And I think some of our talks today have spoken to that. Passivity, I think passivity as a particularly Christian sin. We haven't aware of how big God is. And so we think, well, what can we really do compared to God? And anyway, God's going to fix it all up in the end. And then we also think that it doesn't really matter because of our anthropology and our eschatology. So I'm just going to look at the ways in which we fail to serve and preserve first. It's very easy to feel helpless. And we think that the powers of heaven and earth are against us, and therefore what can we really do? And I think that's why there is so much anxiety out there. Defilement often doesn't happen intentionally, because we don't intend to throw away our bottles and therefore the plastic end up in the guts of an albatross. It's often happened just very, very slowly. We're all parts of a huge system driven by market forces and big corporations seeking profit. And so in order to resist that takes a lot of effort. As Jennifer and Lydia said, we need to really resist that in intentional ways. And so then we think, there's war. I mean, in the face of war, what are our little efforts compared to that? Bankers, multinational companies, the melting ice, the permafrost, and the strong man leaders that are emerging. What can our little actions do? And compared to that, and that's very easy for all of us to think that. I think not just Christians, and yet I think the talks that we've been given today do show that one person really can do something. And also that we can affect our cities and our organisations, and also that some of them are on the side of the angels, and we can really help them. But I also think for Christians, we can think that God has really promised to work with us, and that puts us in a different position in some ways to the rest of the world. Although many other believers out there also believe this. From Romans 8:28, you're probably familiar with the passage that says, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to God's purpose. And this is really a sort of very sovereign way of understanding that passage, as though God's going to do all the work. But Tom Wright has recently re-looked at this passage. He was challenged by someone who said that that's not what it really means. And he went away and revised his interpretation. And he said, yes, it's true. What it's really saying is, we know that God works all things for good together with those who love God. So in other words, it's together with us that God is working. And so that really means that our work really does matter and that we are working together with God. And that, I think, can give us some motivation, that it's sort of like a magnifier. God is doing the work along with us, and we are meant to be agents of God on the earth. And that's why I think in Genesis 1 and 2, we're given this role of having some sort of role of serving and preserving. And then I think there is the particularly Christian problem, which is surely God is in control. And surely we can just leave it all to God. And surely we are too fallen to make a difference. These are all problems that I think we tend to think as Christians. Now, secular people who don't believe in God don't think this because they are sure that it's all up to us. So we're the ones who are meant to be thinking that we're here to represent God and to be priests to the natural world and all those sorts of things. And instead, we often think, well, who are we to act when God is so big? And that is a very big problem, I think, the problem of Christian passivism. And these are Christian failings. But I think that if you read the Bible, it's also all about how we're meant to be acting. It's full of injunctions, that we should do better, that we should be acting in a way that is, loving and is healing. And the Bible wouldn't be saying those sorts of things if we weren't meant to be acting. And so God, we know, is present, but God doesn't come along and zap things. God doesn't come away and take all the plastic away. God doesn't come away and decrease the carbon dioxide. That's all up to us as God's agents. And we know that we can be working with God, but that it's very important that we don't let the Bible make us feel completely passive and as though it's not up to us. We don't really understand why things are the way they are, why God has created the world and created us, but this is how it is, and so we have to work. We have to work with a certain amount of lack of understanding of why things are the way they are. We also, I think, in Christian circles, speak a lot about fallenness. And I think that can also make us passive because there's an interpretation of fallenness, which is that we are metaphysically changed in some way, and therefore we're incapable of doing good. And I think it's very important not to see fallenness in that way. We are capable of doing good. We are capable of healing. We are capable of, having governments that make good decisions. And there are examples of those around the world. And so that's another, I'm just rushing over this, but I think it's important to see that our theology can often make us, can often handicap us in the work of doing good in the world with respect to the environment. And then there are the particular theological handicaps that have existed in the last 100 years, especially to do with how we understand our body, soul, and spirit, and how we understand the end times. Now, I'm sure that no Methodists believe in the Left Behind series, but some Baptists do. And, not pointing the finger at anyone, but I was actually living in the American South during the first Gulf War, and I can assure you that the whole of the American South believed in Armageddon and was almost looking forward to that because they thought that Jesus was coming back. So that's a real thing. And it's very, very unfortunate and that we've got to sort of work against that because even liberal Methodists and Anglicans, we can sometimes think that, well, God's just going to do it all in the end anyway, and so therefore, why do anything now? And also, I think, in times in Christian history, not only has eschatology or end times been a problem, a very hard body-soul, spirit dualism can also work against us because we think that all that matters is spirit. On the other hand, the 20th century was a very materialist century, and materialism can also work against us because when materialism sort of gets transferred into a Christian context, you find people saying, well, it's just the resurrection in the body in the distant future that's going to matter. And that sort of also disincentivizes working here and now because people think, well, it's just the new heavens and the new earth that's going to matter. And but the 20th century was also a century in which Christian theology moved away from nature as a theological source, especially under Karl Barth. Some of you might have heard of Karl Barth, but he was very much against seeing God in nature because he thought we would get led astray. And I think that was a theological move that did not help care of creation. And it sort of trickled its way into churches everywhere. And as I said, I think that the theology of fall has also worked against us because we see ourselves as almost metaphysically changed so that we cannot organize ourselves in ways that really help. So I think that it's very important to understand and to actually sort of preach that both both matter and spirit do matter. And that whatever happens, materiality matters. It's a part of the story. It's almost as though, spirit in matter gives us time and gives us all the great joys and fruits that come from being in space and time. And that what we do in space and time really does matter. Just as it mattered to Jesus, it mattered what Jesus' actual history was, and that when he was resurrected, he bore the scars of this life, showing that what happened in this life really did matter in the next. That whatever we do does endure for good and ill, whatever the future brings. That matter matters, but so does spirit as well. So we have to get back to a much more balanced understanding of matter and spirit. And I think Maori and also other indigenous cultures are examples of cosmologies that honour the ancestors or tipuna or spirits, but also honour the earth. And so they shouldn't be sort of in competition with each other, which they often are in a Christian context. So those are the three things that I think really do hamper Christians in particular, so that we're worse off really than the rest of the world when it comes to actually doing creation care. And it's why, until recently, eco-church has not been a big thing, because Christians have almost been against it. Okay, what actually helps humans to serve and preserve, ironically, I think contemplation really helps, because it helps us to be more connected to the natural world. Understanding our sense of connectedness to the whole of the natural world and the planet, and perhaps even to the far distant planets, it also helps, and that's something that we can get through science, and then various other theologies and churches also, I think, help. So I'm going to look at those three now. So paying attention, I think, is an important part of the solution to climate change and to pollution. Contemplation is a part of the resistance. And so it's very good to go out walking and to look at nature and to sort of feel as though you're a part of nature. And that's very easy in New Zealand. I think it's important to see that nature has a face, that it's signing to us in some way. So, for example, Bruce Foltz says, in the Psalter, that classic anthology of Hebrew poetry and song, is to be found an aesthetic appreciation of the inner life. Here nature presents a face, here expresses an inner life, only because it is at the same time disclosed as being turned radically and ecstatically toward a distance unto which all the resonance of that life is directed, and from which that life itself is derived. So in other words, the creation itself is praising God and is facing God, and therefore has a face. And as we enter into contemplation or just participation in nature, we learn to have a different relationship to it. Contrast that with Dawkins, for example, who said that the world does not speak. We should not imagine that the world presents us with a legible face. And I should say, of course, that Dawkins is actually shifting somewhat, and he's claiming now to be a cultural Christian. So who knows where he'll end up. But that is what he has said in the past. Lynn White Jr., who some of you may know, about almost 60 years ago, sort of started the eco-theological conversation by claiming that Christians were responsible for the ecological crisis. This is in 1968. So he was seeing a crisis even back then. And many people were in the 1960s, And he said it's because Christians have an instrumental view of nature because of Genesis. In other words, he was saying we tend to look at nature as just something for our own good. It's sort of like an endless resource of stuff that we can extract from it or use it for. And he sort of blames our interpretation of Genesis 1, that we're subduing it and we are ruling, but we don't realize that we should be serving and preserving. And he says that even back then, although most people don't read this bit, that what we need, because he himself was a Christian, is a revival of Franciscan wisdom within our churches. And he says we shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature exists only to help humans. And so I think it's very interesting that 50 years later we do get encyclical from not St. Francis, Pope Francis, and in which he does talk about the need for creation care at great length. So attention means not picking up a plastic bottle. It means, in the first place, it means not throwing away plastic in a place that could get into the sea. It means being aware of the interconnectedness of land, plastic, sea, animals, and all that depend on them. And, so that's just that first bit then. The second way, I think, which is helps, which is related really to paying attention, is that this is an amazing time to be alive because we understand our interconnectedness and the interconnectedness of all forms of life in a way that we didn't before. If we just took Genesis 1 very seriously, we might think that we are the only beings that matter on earth and that God made us in God's own image and the rest is just animals, or plants. But we now know that we are animals and we are plants and we are all connected as part of the great tree of life. So this interconnectedness is something that we really understand. In the past, people were convinced that planets and fortunes were linked, so they had a very deep understanding of interconnection, and it was called astrology, for example. Although they did also understand the healing capacities of plants around them also, in a way that we don't. So they lived much closer to the rhythms of the land. But we now know astounding things that they didn't know, and which should really help us to honor life. For example, I don't know if any of you have read the book Untangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. He talks about the way in which fungi are absolutely essential to all living creatures, plants and animals. Just Darwin's understanding of the tree of life should make us understand that we are all connected to all plants and animals. And we now know an awful lot from just observing animals like chimpanzees and other mammals, for example, that they also share with us a lot of our emotions and a lot of our, just way of being in the world. And we're much closer to them than we ever imagined. And then just recently, the people have been sort of seeing that even under the ground, not only are there fungi, but other microbes that really make it they're absolutely essential for life above the earth as well. So we understand all this in a way that we never understood it before, because we haven't got a scientific view of the world. And then in physics, of course, we understand, for example, we can see to almost 12 billion years away, which is absolutely staggering with the Webb telescope. This is the Pillars of Creation, which is only 6,500 light years away. But it's extraordinary, and this is concerned with the birth of stars. So we now know that we're connected even to distant parts of the universe. We know that we may live not just in 4 dimensions, but in 10 or 11. We know, like the physics of entanglement, for example, that things are connected even when they seem not to be or couldn't possibly be because they're beyond the speed of light. So these things should make us see that we're part of an intricate system and that we need to be very careful with this system and preserving it. And of course, we now know that plastic will circulate the globe. We can't just throw away our plastic and it's not going to be connected to something far down the line, and that it might end up in delicate and wondrous creatures like the albatross, and also in us. So we also are having microplastics in our guts and in our organs as well. And then there are also theologies that really can help, as well as the ones that don't help. It's important that although the creation isn't God, it shares some of the character of God and reveals the nature of God, and is a temple for God's Spirit. So, for example, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of God's hands. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been seen, being understood from what has been made. So in other words, we're constantly being asked in Scripture to see that the earth does belong to God and isn't just a dead thing that's separate from God, which is how the world has often been seen in the past. And then one of the most profound statements, Colossians 1:15-19, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. So in other words, the Redeemer is also the Creator. And I think that's a very profound truth, that Jesus didn't come just as the Redeemer, but also as the incarnation of the Creator as well. And so therefore that makes creation particularly amazing and particularly divine in some sort of sense. Again, I'm just rushing through all this. Other theologies that do help, it's very important to read Scripture with the understanding that all its injunctions and all its moral urgings show us that we do have freedom to act, and we have agency, and we have a responsibility for the planet. We can't just leave it all to God. I think the visions of fecundity, for example, at the end of the book of Revelation are really important. The images of restoration in Isaiah are very important. So although there are terrible warnings in Scripture, there are also these images of the peaceable kingdom and of healing for the nations at the end of time. The theology of deep incarnation is important, that when Jesus came as a human being, Jesus was also, of course, a mammal. Jesus had gut bacteria like we have. Jesus had DNA. Jesus had social status as well, just like we have. So Jesus, the incarnation was something which didn't just barely affect human beings. He was a part of the ecosystem as well. And also that what God has created together will be redeemed together. We know, which means that the rest of the natural world is just as important as us in the story of redemption. We now know that human beings came along on the last second, so to speak, of the evolutionary story, and that God didn't just create all these other creatures over an enormous period of time just for human beings to come along, that we're just part of the whole big story. And therefore, God cares for all of it as well. Okay, how do churches help? Churches can often feel quite beleaguered. They can these days feel as though they're just a sort of a place that sensible people don't go, on a Sunday morning or a Saturday afternoon. But on the other hand, I think we do have things that help. We understand repentance. We understand, which just really means turning around. So we know that we can actually stop doing some things and turn around and do other things. And we need to model that in our communities. We are organised, and therefore, some of us are organised anyway. So that means that we can organise for good, for the natural environment as well. In Arusha, we are getting some money from city councils because city councils realise that churches make for resilient communities, and so churches do make for resilient communities. And so even though we feel small and inadequate, we really are an important part of the whole community structure. Christians do hope, and not just unfounded hope, but hope that really is based on the nature of things. We now know that we have a mission to all God's creatures and not just to other human beings. We do understand justice, and so an awful lot of things like plastic, as Lydia was talking about, are problems of justice. That our refuse ends up on somebody else's shore. We understand that nature is sacred. At least I think we should understand that. And also, as I mentioned, that God does work with us. So all of these are things which mean that churches really should be little centres of light in our communities, even though the communities don't understand that. So what can we all do? Apart from all the wonderful things which Jennifer and Lydia have talked about, we can pay attention to nature. I think paying attention is the beginning of everything else. I think we can also pay attention to science. All those hidden little headlines where it says scientists make a breakthrough here or there, they're important to our understanding of the world, and I think we should read them as well, instead of just reading about all the rapes and murders. And I think the scientific headlines are very important. I think we should think hard about how we feel demotivated and read the scriptures prayerfully, looking for ways of being part of the solution. And, there are lots of ways of that. We could make habits of all the practical solutions that we've heard today, for example, and embed them in our church life as well. It's also very important to vote. Voting is a way in which we can influence the 75% that comes from institutions and organizations and governments. We can find some, I actually did a talk like this to some Baptists, a big Baptist church, and the youth were a little bit worried about the voting thing. They thought I was encouraging them to vote Green. But I did say, though, that these solutions have to be bipartisan in the end, and that even if you are a member of the National Party or even the ACT Party, you're going to have to get them on board with this as well. Find some way of making your work be connected to the great enterprise of planetary healing, so especially if you're a young person starting out and deciding what to do, or you have children, there are wonderful things that can be done in numerous ways. We need, for example, apparently America needs 1 million electricians just to make this change to a sustainable future. We probably need lots and lots of those too. So just even becoming an electrician can be a big help. The other day, we do have solar panels. There was somebody checking our extra solar panels that came, and he recognized me because he had been a theological student of mine, and he said that he's doing a PhD in biblical studies at Otago, but he's also got a business checking the electrics on solar panels. And I thought that was wonderful. You're sort of like doing both things. You're honouring your call to do biblical studies, but at the same time, you're being really useful to the world. And then become an eco-church. I've got to sort of say that, That's, if you become an eco-church, you get all these good resources on the website, and also you get encouraged by sort of joining a whole lot of other churches that are on the same journey. So there are some headlines, and there are some wonderful albatross, hopefully without any plastic in their guts. So thank you.